Welcome back and to the series on mapping the shadow. Today we have another cheery topic. We're going to be talking about the role of suffering. Something that we all know very well. We all suffer every day, and it's a bit of a problem, right? It's something we'd rather not have to go through if we can help it. But as has hopefully been made clear throughout this series, and certainly the last few episodes, is that there's nothing in this world or in your mind that serves no purpose, or that has no reason for being there, or it doesn't even have a light side and a dark side. Even suffering itself has a kind of light side. What's that about? And after all, if it was a bad thing in itself, in its entirety, that served no purpose and just shouldn't be here, well, it kind of begs the question, why is it there? Why do we suffer? If it just serves no purpose and exists for no reason, then the universe is really glitching up and it's not making sense. It's contradicting itself. So we're going to explore this. But by the way, another reason I want to explore this is because many traditions in today's world are obsessed with eliminating suffering, and we can understand why. And not only spiritual traditions, especially from the East, but also science, materialism, and materialist philosophy, and even to an extent, maybe a slightly lesser extent, but nonetheless to quite a large extent, modern shadow work practice is often concerned with eliminating suffering. Like, life would be better if we just eliminated suffering. Almost kind of by definition, one might think. But I certainly disagree. I think that suffering plays a role, a very important role, and that if you take eliminating suffering as your goal, well, you're familiar with this by now, right? You've just adopted another thesis, a potentially useful one, which nonetheless, when taken to its extreme, becomes problematic. So to an extent, yes, it provides a very good guide, but of course, suffering itself is a manifestation. It itself is not the problem. It may be reflective of a problem, and that's also the whole point. So before we get into that, sort of bring us back to this quote by Hegel. In fact, this is the first time I've shared this particular quote. I could have easily shared this earlier because it captures a lot of what he was about. So he said in the Philosophy of Rights that what is reasonable is actual, and what is actual is reasonable. So this is a very concise way of summarizing what I've been trying to convey the last few episodes here about just the self-contained nature of existence and of our minds. It all checks out in the end, even when it seems to not make sense to us. From some perspective, it can and must all make sense. And that the great unfolding that we're experiencing individually, but also the unfolding of history, is the realization of this truth, coming into ever greater realization. So what is actual, in other words, what actually exists that we can see explicitly and experience, is based on reason. And likewise, what is based on reason comes into existence, which means that it all makes sense, it all checks out. Nothing contradicts at its essence. And this also applies to the phenomena of suffering and everything else I've discussed so far. Schelling said that the representations of the divinity can be independent beings only. But what is the limiting element in our representations, other than exactly what we see is not independent? God looks at the things in themselves. So what Schelling is getting at here is this inevitable misalignment between us and our essence, between our existence and our essence, between what there is in its totality and what we is right now. And only God looks at the things in themselves, in their whole. And thus each of us needs to be a mere representation. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. We have to be independent. But in being independent, we must fall short, we must miss the mark, and we must suffer, because there's always going to be this misalignment. And that's actually not necessarily such a bad thing. So in kind of the same way, I've said here like that you wouldn't speak of unnecessary gravity. Like gravity's so annoying. If only we just turn it off from time to time. Like we just want to go to Mars. Like why not just, if we just turn off gravity, we could be there in no time, right? Well, this is a misunderstanding. Like in the same way when people talk about unnecessary suffering, I don't think that you can ever say there's such a thing as unnecessary suffering. Just as like if you set fire to petrol in your car's engine, you can't say that there's unnecessary heat given off. Just as when you take off in a plane, again, you can't say that the gravity is unnecessary. Like it's unnecessary when you're taking off. It'd be quite good if gravity didn't exist at that point in time. And if it would be kind of convenient if gravity could just turn on at the precise moment that you want to come back down to Earth again. Clearly, this is nonsense because gravity exists by consequence of there being an Earth, there being mass, and the gravitational force that produces. And in the same way, suffering is an energetic conflict, whether it be physical, mental, emotional. What we experience as suffering is an energetic conflict. There's two things trying to be at the same time. And also the resistance to non-existence. So we might suffer because some part of us is reaching into non-existence, another part is trying to maintain that existence, for all the reasons I've discussed over the last several episodes. So on some level, there's actually no such thing as unnecessary suffering. It's only from a certain perspective that it can seem unnecessary. It may seem gratuitous, but to say it's unnecessary is a misunderstanding of what suffering actually is. Suffering is an energetic necessity. It's something that must occur. There's no way you can be partial and not suffer because you're not fully aligned with what you could be, let alone the whole, let alone with everything else that exists around you. So it's necessary in that sense. It's necessary in the sense of it wouldn't be possible to have an existence without it. It's not that existence is just undesirable and falling short because it contains suffering. It's like, no, actually, you could not have an existence without suffering for those reasons. So then it's not a glitch. It's not like the universe makes complete sense in every way, except for the fact that it contains suffering. Oh, oops, why is that? Why could it not be some other way? It simply couldn't be any other way. If it didn't exist, well, I mean, it's a nonsense question. It's a nonsense point for the reasons I've said, but if you turned off your pain, as many people try to do, whether pharmaceutically or through spiritual bypassing, through any other method, it has a tremendous knock-on effect on their development and their direction and their understanding. So while a universe without suffering can't exist, there are certainly many attempts to reduce and eliminate suffering. And in doing so, it causes all manner of problems. So suffering itself is not a glitch. And I think that key to shadow work is not to eliminate suffering, certainly not, but to understand it and to change your relationship to it. So in some objective sense, that doesn't eliminate suffering, but in a way it does, because you change your relationship to it. It changes the experience of it, sure. But here's the key. If you're trying to get away from suffering for its own sake, if you just want to make that pain go away, you're creating a dichotomy. This is a very common thing that you see, right? It's what we think of as actually escaping the pain, the suffering, the shadow, is actually creating more of it. Take any thesis, take any archetype, take any idea. You might say, we've tried everything. You might say, like, for example, someone who's very, very disciplined. I've tried everything. I've just been more and more and more structured. I've become so structured that I've become rigid. Well, guess what? That actually makes you the opposite. It makes you unreliable. If you're so structured that you're just completely rigid, you then actually bring a kind of unreliability to that. You become the very thing you're trying to avoid. This is how shadow dynamics work. So in trying to avoid suffering, it's exactly the same way. The more desperately you try to avoid suffering, the more you'll create it. And it was Arno Gruen that said, it is not those who suffer who are weak, but those who fear suffering. Anna Watt said something similar around he who is trying to avoid suffering is still fundamentally afraid of it. So inner work, shadow work, is not about eliminating suffering. It's about understanding it and changing your relationship to it. And as I've said, suffering is the experience of energetic conflict. So the experience itself is not exactly the problem, but it's expressing an energetic conflict that must be resolved. Like, it has to be resolved at some point, because otherwise there'd be a contradiction there. So it can play out for quite some time and it can persist for quite some time, but eventually things have to come back down to earth, because for the same reason that we're having this talk right now, for the same reason I'm talking to you on this computer, for the same reason that the cars outside are driving back and forth, if we were to deny the necessity of suffering and conflict, all of those laws on which all of those things depend would have to fall apart. But even though suffering is by definition painful, it's actually just one side of the coin as well. Because on the other side of suffering is meaning. When you face that tension, you experience that energetic conflict manifesting as suffering, you can allow those two aspects of the conflict to come together, whatever that is. Again, if it's someone who loves to be very structured, they have to come to terms with the fact that they can actually be unreliable and they can be rigid, and they can allow those two things to contact each other in the crucible of their mind. And that is experienced as tension and pain. But when they can reconcile, they come back to baseline, they come back to true discipline. Guess what? That's real meaning. The thing they always wanted, they were hanging out with through this image of structure and discipline, acting like the toughest person in the world, releasing videos on Instagram of running ultra marathons, whatever it is, and showing the world how strong they are and getting all those kicks from all the likes and comments and stuff. They're hanging out with an idea of themselves. It's a persona of toughness, of structure, which then becomes rigid. And it's not the real thing, because if it was, it wouldn't need to be so performative. It wouldn't need the world to reflect it back. So it's unintegrated because it still needs the world to show it what it wants to be. But when it's integrated, it becomes true discipline. It's a place of greater freedom. Hence, on the other side of suffering is meaning. And so the likes of Viktor Frankl spoke endlessly about this, the man's search for meaning. And Nietzsche, who said that he who has a why can bear almost any how. So if you know why you're doing what you're doing and you realize that you're moving towards a greater reconciliation and a fuller realization of yourself, then it changes the very tone of suffering. It changes your entire experience of it. It may objectively be the same thing. It may be more or less the very same conflict. But in realizing that it actually is taking you somewhere and it serves a purpose, it makes it almost entirely endurable. You can bear anything. And so developing self-knowledge does not involve eliminating suffering, but it does involve changing your relationship to it. And so the image I've got here is of like a woodland path on a mountain leading up towards somewhere. And this sort of is loosely supposed to imply that suffering is like a guardrail. It's like a guardrail that keeps you on track towards wholeness. Because what's going to happen if you become completely one-sided, you go way up there into the power position, you go way up there into ruthlessness or rigidity or apparent selflessness or severity, cruelty, what's going to happen? You're going to begin to contradict yourself. Not necessarily contradict someone else, well, that too. You're going to contradict yourself. And that is impossible to do permanently. Like, it's not going to last. So it's going to create conflict. It's going to lead to tension inevitably. And that is simply like a guardrail that keeps you on the path towards greater self-realization. And there are many examples of people who can't feel pain or have certain diseases, which means they can't feel physical pain. Or like people with disorders who can't experience fear or mental pain. Well, it completely removes the ability to adapt and transform in a healthy way. So in the case of people who can't feel heat through their fingers, for example, they can burn themselves very easily because they just don't know when they're being burnt. And so pain exists for a perfectly good reason. It would be a terrible thing to not be able to experience pain. Now that can, of course, be taken too far and you can end up suffering a lot. In the past, not on this series, but in other places, I've talked about an uncle of mine who was in a lot of pain his whole life, disabled almost for life, and lived to a good old age, and no doubt on some level suffered tremendously. But at the same time, he was completely at peace with himself, and he was a very happy man and a very inspirational man who never complained once, amazingly. And so despite, I can only imagine the tremendous amount of physical pain that he had to experience, he still turned it into meaning. And so even in his case, like, many might have looked at him and judged it as just, oh, that's just unnecessary suffering. And yet he was able to contribute incalculably because of what he experienced and the inspiration he set for other people. I mean, to this day, I've never known anyone like him. I mean, even his electrician turned up to his funeral, right? He was really one of a kind. So even in his example, supposed unnecessary suffering actually was entirely teleological. It was entirely purposeful. And he found a lot of meaning through it, I do believe. So this brings us back to this overarching point here, which is just around the relationship to suffering itself. And if you're familiar with my 7 habits model, this does pertain quite somewhat to empathy, which is the willingness to meet and be transformed by experience and to transform experience in turn. And that means that it's about embracing suffering. Be willing to suffer. Don't be afraid of suffering. You're going to be afraid of suffering naturally, but be willing to suffer. Don't think that suffering is a bad thing or that you've done something wrong if you're suffering. This is a nonsense. This is a put-down theory of the universe. It's a put-down theory of yourself, which itself is self-contradictory, right? Because it's only yourself that is capable of putting yourself down. So it's amazing how relieving this can be. Like, forget all of that stuff that says you need to eliminate suffering, or that if you do suffer, there's something wrong with you. And one of the greatest epitomes of this is in modern medicine, right? That just treats the symptom. Okay, it's built on certain principles and precepts that talk about getting to the root cause and so on. But actually, when you look at how it's practiced, it's not doing that, largely. A lot of it is not doing that. Why? Because it's way up there in the power position. It's got an idea of itself, it's insisting upon that to the nth degree, and it just does what it does. It takes the particulars and doubles down on those to such an extent that it forgets why it was doing what it's doing. So that's another reason why that whole thesis of modern medicine is reaching a kind of crescendo right now, why so many people are steering away from it and going to alternative ways of dealing with their ailments and symptoms. They're seeing the truth of it. This is just the shadow. This is what happens. This is the arc of transformation, right? The thesis of modern medicine, vaccines and mRNA and all of this reached a peak to the point where it had to come up against the other side. It's actually very simple when you think about it. So in a similar kind of way to how the universe is all the better for the fact that it contains evil, not because evil does good in some weird kind of irony, but because the very goodness of the universe, the very fact that you have freedom, also gives rise to evil. It cannot not do that to some extent. When in exactly the same way, the greatest irony and the greatest relief will come from realizing that suffering too is subject to a similar kind of law here. Your experience is all the better for the fact that it contains suffering. Figure that out. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't exist. There'd be no meaning, there'd be no development, there'd be no guardrail to your development or growth. You'd never be uncomfortable. You just exist in a seed, never differentiating, never going forth. Because as Schelling described, well, many slides ago, it is the fear of life itself that drives man out of the centrum into which he was created. So without that, you wouldn't have any of it. You wouldn't have any existence, you wouldn't have any growth, any differentiation, none of it. So there's a tremendous relief and realization that comes from acknowledging the role of suffering in the world, that actually your life is all the better for it. Now, do not mistake me here, and do not misunderstand me as saying that suffering in itself is good, or that you ought to try and make yourself suffer more. No, in just the same way as you ought not to go and do evil things, you ought not to willfully contradict yourself and become dissonant, or in exactly the same way, suffering is not there to be created willfully. You're not trying to cause it. You're not trying to cause additional conflict, but you're recognizing the role of it, that when conflict does occur, which it must inevitably occur, you can use it as a way to guide yourself back. And because he who has a why can bear almost any how, it changes your relationship to it. You can kind of make friends with it. And you can do that through empathy, through bare attention, through being willing to experience it, and also through dedicated inner work like active imagination and meditation. If you're not embodying empathy, then what are you doing active imagination? Why are you bothering doing qigong or meditation? If you're not practicing empathy or embodying empathy, then you're completely dissonant already. So any practice is just going to reify that dissonance. It's just going to be seen in terms of that pre-existing image, that pre-existing thesis that you're not willing to let go of. So basically, do it if you want, but whatever you do, there's no point me even saying, because you've already decided that that's how things are. And you're using those things as a way to develop that self-image, not to actually reconcile with the self. So then, I'm going to end here just by relaying another principle from my 7 Habits model, and that is the 2 kinds of pain. So there's actually 2 kinds of pain or 2 kinds of suffering that's really helpful to delineate. And again, this is all part of developing your relationship to suffering and being able to tell the difference between these 2 things. Because sometimes we're told that, right, like no pain, no gain, right? Whatever that means. Or that cold showers are good for you, even though they're uncomfortable. But this doesn't really give us much to go on by way of understanding when pain might actually be genuinely harmful, when what we're experiencing is harmful and therefore it's probably not a good idea to do it, versus those times when actually we need to experience a bit of pain and harm in order to progress and develop. So hence we have these 2 kinds of pain. We have the pain of harm and the pain of release. And it's very simple. To illustrate this, I've got a picture of a guy emptying water into a bucket from a giant water butt. Right, so basically he's emptying the tank of water. And this is an analogy for the pain of release. He's releasing, in this case, water, but whatever, the analogy kind of works. He's releasing pain, or releasing water from the tank. It's already in there. It's already being done. The damage has already been done. There's a conflict that already exists, regardless of whether it's appearing in the conscious mind or not at this time. But he can re-access that. It's either going to be something he does in response to just what's happening in his world, or he can seek it out proactively through dedicated inner work, through coaching, through therapy, however he wants to do it. So he's re-engaging with something that's already there. So, for example, in active imagination practice, you engage with your own unconscious, and often that is very difficult and often very painful. And some people misinterpret this as though therefore you're doing harm to yourself in opening up a connection with the unconscious. Now, of course, there is a need to be careful and cautious and steady with this practice. You don't want to open the aperture too quickly and re-traumatize yourself. That's generally pretty hard to do with active imagination, but it does need to be said. But either way, don't confuse that for the pain of harm. It can be the pain of harm if you do it too fast or too much. But by and large, what you experience in active imagination, if you do it right, you do it with wholesome intention, is going to be the pain of release. You're not causing pain by doing active imagination. You're bringing to conscious awareness something that already exists, a conflict that already exists in the mind. So you're actually releasing what's already there. So then the pain of harm, by contrast, is like filling the tank back up again. Right? So this is actually doing damage to you, the mind. It's creating additional conflict. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's unnecessary suffering, because whatever conflict you create and go around foolishly, like the fool from the tarot, right, go around creating, can be reconciled with later. If you do this, you're going to learn from it. If you go and venture out and fall off a few cliffs, there's going to be lessons to learn from that. If you need to do that, it means you haven't already learned the lesson. But if you have learned the lesson, it means you don't need to do that. So there's very few situations where you would heedlessly and unnecessarily go and do that. From some perspective, it might seem like you're just causing yourself unnecessary suffering. But really what's going on is that you're creating additional conflict or the pain of harm through this process of exploration or differentiation of yourself into particulars that need to later be reconciled. So as much as there's a harm that's being caused there, it does nonetheless lead to lessons in the end. And there's no way around that. So again, it just helps you think in terms of these two kinds of pain, the pain of harm and the pain of release. Now, the pain of release is a sign that what you're doing is moving in the direction of integration. It's a good thing. It may feel painful. It may be unpleasant. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. That doesn't mean that suffering is bad or that you ought not to do it. The pain of release is also temporary. This is another really important thing to bear in mind, that every unit of focus you give it and every moment you spend experiencing it is yet another moment of its release. And this can be something emotional, but it can also be something physical, like a headache. Often when we experience a headache, the inclination is to just make it go away. Take a paracetamol or take diclofenac or something that has pretty known and not insignificant side effects, just to make that go away. And some kinds of headache can be so bad that it's like you just will do anything to make it go away. But this too can be reframed as a kind of pain of release. There's a reason you have the headache. Now, there might still be a case for pursuing some kind of relief from that. If it's just too much, if it's more than you can assimilate in any one moment, it goes beyond pain of release and becomes pain of harm. But generally speaking, the mind on its own is pretty good at attenuating the amount of content that comes into the conscious mind. Just like this guy using the tap to empty the tank, your mind is a bit like that too. It has a way of throttling experience through this censorship, inhibition, or the directedness of mind that Jung referred to. It's like a funnel, like it's only dealing with so much at once. There might be external factors that override that or overload that, and that's when you get the pain of harm and trauma that then has to be reconciled with. But by and large, on your own, your mind is pretty good at throttling what you experience. So, don't be afraid of facing up to pain. And just on this final note here, one of the worst things that can be done for the development of self-knowledge is to avoid pain, is to try and eliminate suffering. The easiest way to eliminate suffering is just to take medication and never leave the house. And there are many folks who do that. And it's a downward spiral. It becomes very, very hard to get out of. So do not be afraid of it. If anything else, that is empathy. It's the willingness to meet and be transformed by experience. And this is why I differentiate empathy from compassion, or the conventional understanding of empathy as just feeling what other people feel. Empathy is about being willing to feel what you feel as much as it is about being willing to feel what other people feel. So I'll leave you on that. Suffering is not a glitch. It's an important thing. It's a necessary thing, and you can make friends with it. And in fact, doing so is actually a vital ingredient in the development of your own self-knowledge. So with that said, guys, I'll thank you. If you'd like to check out the self-study courses, go over to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. There are 5 courses available there, including 2 courses on shadow work, a course on active imagination, the Make It Conscious philosophy, and the Way of Individuation 7 Habits course. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.